Well, good morning. It's great to have all of you guys here with us this morning. We're going to be in John chapter 1. We're going to be starting in verse 45, going through verse 51. If you guys want to turn there in your Bibles, if you don't have a Bible or a mobile device that you can connect to a Bible with, there are pew Bibles in front of you. Also, you guys might have seen out in the foyer, Dan set up a little demonstration, but there is a place in the new pews. If you look in the new seats, not pews, seats, there's a little loop in the bottom, and you can put your communion cup right in there, both when it's full and when it's empty. So it serves a dual purpose. So make sure and check that out. So many new features. John chapter 1, verse 45 is where we're at. We've been talking about, and we're actually finishing up today with the sermon series, we've been talking about how Jesus is the Word. And you know, we've been talking about this idea, and it's a really big idea. It goes into this Greek idea of the logos. It goes all the way back into the Hebrew conception of the word and the Aramaic. And basically what we look at here is that Jesus is both the rationality and the reasoning of God, but he's also kind of the thing that publishes or makes known an invisible God. And really, that's the beginning of John's gospel. And remember that John has the purpose of his gospel to give you the information that you need to believe that Jesus is the Christ so that you can have life in him. That's John's stated purpose for writing. And really, he begins where he begins because that is the place that is necessary to get you where he wants you to go, to get you to understand how to have life in Jesus Christ. And so we're finishing up the first chapter of John today with the story of Philip and Nathanael. And so we'll join that in John chapter 1, verse 45. It says, Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel." Jesus answered him, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." Well, it's a great way to finish off this chapter because it brings us kind of full circle from the way that he introduces Jesus as the Word and to this end point where in this imagery that you see of the angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man, you have a reference that goes back both to Jacob's ladder that he had in his vision and also to the temple itself. And so we'll get into how that works here in a second. But we want to look at kind of where we're going to go in the sermon. And that is that we're going to first talk about interpersonal problems. Because, well, why not? You know, it's a Sunday morning. We've all got some. So let's talk about some interpersonal problems. It doesn't need to be confessional, by the way. You can, but we will talk about those. Secondly, we're going to talk about personal standards. And then finally, as we finish up, we want to talk about integration and the temple. How do we understand John finishing up this opening argument that he has? So let's first talk about this issue of interpersonal problems. Why are we talking about this? Well, there's something interesting that happens, and that thing that's interesting that happens, and you might have noticed the pattern here, that there's been several introductions of Jesus and other people, and what happens with these introductions is that they go out and they bring other people to Jesus. Did you notice that? That this is a recurring pattern in this first chapter, is that somebody finds Jesus and they go, "Wow, this is Jesus, and this is the guy we've been waiting for," and then immediately they go out and they bring somebody else to Jesus. Well, why does John do that? It's like, you know, you kind of have to ask yourself after a while, you know, when these writers are writing things, you know, John says that, you know, there was tons more stuff that happened when I was with Jesus that I didn't include here. Well, if that's the case, then why does he include the stories that he includes? There's a reason for it. And so why is this pattern emerging that when people find Jesus, they go out and find other people to find Jesus. Why is it that that takes place? You know, really what it means here is that what you see happening is that when these people decide that Jesus is the Messiah and they're going to follow him, that there's a transformation that happens in their life. And I can't stress this enough. If you find Jesus, if you find him as the Messiah, if you find him as Christ, there's going to be a transformation in your life. It can't help but happen. If you decide that you're going to follow him, following him has consequences. And those consequences are a certain type of freedom that makes you go out and find other people. Now, it may not make sense how freedom is something that's going to make you go out and find other people. But I think that we need to understand this. This is really important. What does it mean to have freedom? What's that? Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you still. All right? Yeah. So no rules, right? Isn't that what we usually mean when we talk about freedom? When we have freedom, usually what we're saying is that I don't have any rules. Do you guys remember when you were young and your parents left the house and left you alone for the first time? Do you guys remember that? And you said to yourself, well, this is what we're going to do. I remember what me and my sister did is we knew, we had, poked around in our house enough that we knew that my dad had some old firecrackers hidden away from when he was a kid, and he would never let us light them off. But I remember the day when my parents left, and they left me and my sister at home alone, and we said, hey, this is the opportunity we've been waiting for, and we went out and we found those firecrackers. And I remember sitting down to light them, and they were so old that the wicks would start to burn, and then they would stop burning, and they would start to burn, and then they would stop. And I remember the wick got down to, it was about, this big. I remember going down there with another match and lighting it, and all of a sudden it went off. My hand was right down by it, and it singed my fingers, but the bigger thing is my head was down there, and so it made my ears ring. And I immediately thought, I've just made myself deaf. I never experienced that loud of a noise that close to my head before, and so I thought, this is it. It's over with. Look what I've done to myself. Well, is that freedom? Freedom, is that really freedom, having no rules? No, freedom is the act of love for good rules. Freedom is an act of love for good rules. So freedom is not when you don't have any rules. It's when you actually love having really good rules. Now, why do I say that that's freedom? Well, because there's a problem. And that problem is that if you think of freedom as having no rules, the problem is that eventually that becomes its own kind of bondage, doesn't it? The thing is, if you live without any kind of rules at all, you end up in a certain kind of bondage. And that bondage has to do with the consequences of doing things that you shouldn't have been doing. That's why, my parents told us, hey, don't mess with those firecrackers, because they didn't want us to live in a certain bondage of maybe having ears ringing for the rest of your life. Right? There's a certain kind of bondage. There's a freedom you miss out on because of those consequences. So, hey, don't do this. But the problem is that once that rule is there, if you have the wrong kind of attitude toward that rule, well, then you don't have freedom either. Right? Because if you sit there and you're given good rules by someone or something that loves you, but you hate and you chafe under the rules, the oppression, you feel like these rules are oppressive to you, well, then what's going to happen is you're not going to feel a sense of freedom in your life. Right? That's the way that it works, is that having no rules ends up with no freedom. Having rules that you don't love ends up with no freedom. Well, having love for good rules is how you end up with freedom. And we all kind of understand this. We all understand that loving good rules is the best possible outcome. Right? How many of you guys, when you were kids, your parents told you it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game, right? And when you were a little kid, did you go, yeah, that's right? No, you said, no, I want to win, right? Now, here's the problem. Maybe at some point in your life you discovered this, is that if you actually go out and all you care about is winning, what's going to happen? Eventually, nobody wants to play the game with you, right? Eventually, people don't want to play with you because you're not fun to play with. You're kind of a big jerk. And so they say, hey, this isn't fun anymore, and so I don't want to do this. But if you play the game properly, if you come to love the rules, because the rules of the game are what allow you to participate with somebody else. You see, the rules are actually not there to constrain you. They're to give you freedom. They're to allow you to participate in something enjoyable with other people. Well, if you start to see the rules that way and you say, hey, how I play the game is important. Can I lose graciously? Can I look at why I lost? Well, then what happens is you become somebody that's enjoyable to play the game with, and people invite you to play the game, and you learn from the game what the game was supposed to teach you. You see, you didn't understand this probably when you were young because all you cared about was winning, but the game itself was designed to teach you. How many of you guys have ever seen little bears play? You know what I'm talking about? You know, little bears? That's how they play, I suppose. So little bears, you get these little bears, they look cute, and don't touch them, though. They have a mama bear somewhere in the vicinity, and she'll tear your arms off. So don't do that. But the little bears, how do they play? Anyone? How do the little bears play? Yeah, they fight. They wrestle, right? They fight with each other, but play fighting. Why do little animals do that? Have you thought about that? Why does God have little animals do that? Well, they do that because they learn the skills of being able to fight and defend themselves when they're bigger, but they learn it in a way that doesn't destroy them, right? Because here's the thing, it's better to learn how to fail with somebody who loves you and will lovingly point out your failures than it is to lose violently in a fight where somebody will exploit that to destroy you. Did you know when you were playing games when you were little, that's what you were supposed to be learning? Did you guys know that? That's what you're doing when you play anytime. You guys remember the game Monopoly? How many loved it? Raise your hand if you loved it. Raise your hand if you hated it. Okay, got some of each here, right? Here's the thing, though, is that all these games are based on what? They're based on the way that we live our life. And in fact, there's that game, life, right? But they're about that, and what are we supposed to learn? Well, the thing is that how many times did you lose because you didn't think ahead? Did anybody ever do that? Man, I remember learning how to play chess. And all the time when I would learn how to play chess, what would happen was I would lose to my dad because I didn't think far enough ahead. Has anybody ever had that experience? You lost because you didn't think ahead. You know what's better than losing to a loan shark when you don't think ahead? Losing in chess to your dad. That's better. You see, what happens is that when we play the game, we lovingly point out each other's faults and flaws. But the only thing that allows that to be productive and good is the rules of the game. Here's the thing. Why is it that when people encounter Jesus, they go out and find other people? Because they're all of a sudden connected to the rules of the game in a loving way. What I mean by that is Jesus is the law. That's what Nathanael gets pointed out to him here by Philip. Philip says, hey, we found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph. And guess what? These rules of the game are actually a person who loves us. And when you encounter the rules of the game as a person who loves you, what happens is that your life gets transformed, and you go find people and you bring them into the game. That's the transformation that possible. Because the thing is, you thought that the rules were there as some sort of punishment. You thought the standard was there. You thought the ideal was there. You thought the idea of perfection was this judge that stood over you. Has anybody ever here, have you guys felt that before? That if you don't live up to the standard, if you don't measure up, that there's something out there just waiting to punish you. I've actually talked to people in our congregation before, and they'll talk about how they feel like their life is like that their life is that God is just waiting to punish them for all the things that they do wrong. If that's your experience of life, you're not going to run out and say to somebody, hey, come join me. You're not going to say to somebody, hey, come on, I've found the judge who stands there above us and metes out our terror. Come join me in his presence. You're not going to do that. But when you find the one of whom the law and the prophets testify, and he is love, you say, come join me. Why? Because when he points out your faults and your flaws, he does so in a way that transforms you into glory. He does so because of his love for you. He does so because he wants to share with you the glory of God. He wants you to be invited into the glory of God. He wants you to be transformed by the glory of God. He's doing it out of love. He's doing it out of his great desire to bless you. When you find that person, you say, come on. Come find him. Come and see. That's such a great thing in this passage. Nathanael said to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And there's a kind of a debate about what was going on here. Was just Nazareth, was it just kind of like this, was it like Joplin, Missouri? What good can come out of there? If you've been to Joplin. Is that what it is? Or other people say, well, no, what was happening there was that they knew what the prophecies were in Nazareth. Like, that's not part of the prophecies. Of course, Jesus was originally from Bethlehem, that is, but this is Jesus being introduced as Jesus of Nazareth. What good could come out? What is going on there? And so there's a skepticism here. And this skepticism is interesting because the way that it's dealt with is not, well, here, let me show you. Let me get this out and let me draw a chart and talk about how all of this lines up. You see, that's what happens when we get met with skepticism a lot. Because we misunderstand the nature of evangelism. But Philip says something really interesting to him, something very profound and something so simple that it calls us into being like him. Philip said to him, come and see. Did you realize that evangelism is that simple? That evangelism is just saying, come and see? But you know, in order for you to say, come and see, you had to have an experience with him. And that's the thing, is that Philip goes out and finds Nathanael. Why? Because he's had an experience with Jesus. And because he's had an experience with Jesus, he says, come and see. And here's the great thing. If you've had an experience with Jesus, that's all you need. Because your job is not to convince somebody that Jesus is the Christ. Jesus can do that. But if you put all that weight on your shoulders and you say, well, I have to go and I have to know the Romans road and I have to know, I got to know all these different, you get your little, what were they called? Chick tracks. Yes, you got to memorize your chick tracks and you got to have all that down. And then what happens if I get asked a question that I don't know? How many of you have ever feared that? What happens if I get a question that I don't know? Well, here's the thing that's great, is that we know how to do that because Philip gets asked a question that he doesn't know. Nathanael said to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Philip said, come and see. That's all you have to do. Come and see. Because Jesus can take care of things on his own. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, it says, but in your hearts honor Christ as Lord, as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. You see, the idea behind that passage is that you're going to be transformed by your experience with Jesus. And then when you're transformed with your experience with Jesus, people are going to say, what's wrong with you? That's how they'll say it. What's wrong with you? Because notice he says, you need to give a defense for this. They're going to say, what's wrong with you? Don't you know the world is terrible? Don't you know everything's awful right now? Why are you happy? Why do you have joy? Why do you have hope? Why do you have peace? Why are you different? And then you say, well, here's my defense. I've met Jesus. Come and see. Come and see. Have a testimony. If you look at your life and your life hasn't been transformed, then maybe the person that you've met with isn't the Jesus that's in Scripture, because that happens a lot. And all of us have some kind of scales on our eyes to some extent. We don't see clearly enough who Jesus is. And so maybe there's a process that needs to happen with you in prayer, that you need to start being able to see clearly who Jesus is. Because a lot of times what happens is we get communicated in our lives, and maybe early on, a different kind of Jesus, and that clouds the way that we see him all the rest of our lives. And it happens a lot of times when we have different authority figures in our life, maybe a parent or somebody else, and that person is this raging judge over us. And so when it says that God is our Father, then we kind of have this tendency to associate Jesus in that mix. And we start seeing him as the guy that stands over us and metes down punishment, not the person who lovingly takes the punishment that was due us, not the person who in love invites us into glory. You have no need to convince people. Well, those settle the interpersonal problems, but what about the second part of this, which is the personal standards? Now, when they meet Jesus and they find out that the law is actually something that loves them, their interpersonal problems get transformed. In fact, everything about their life becomes transformed. But we see here that it's very clear in Scripture that Jesus is who the law and the prophets are writing about. The law and the prophets point to Jesus. Jesus is who they refer to. Now, the problem that we have is that the minute that we have any kind of rule or standard over us, and this is the problem of the law. Remember, Jesus is being pointed out as the one who the law points to. The minute that we have a problem, or the minute that we have a law over us, we have a problem. And we've been talking about this in our Sunday school classes. We're going over the end of the book of Revelation. And that problem is this, is that you have a need for a standard. We've mentioned it here as well in the last couple weeks. We have a need for a standard. We have a need for a law. We have a need for something above us. We have a need for the good to be defined. Because if you don't have the good defined, you don't know where to point your life. And if you don't know where to point your life, you can't make any progress toward anything. And if you can't make any progress toward anything, neurochemically even, if you go down to that small of a granular look at this, you can't experience happiness and joy, because happiness and joy actually doesn't come from getting good things. It comes from approaching things that are of great value. As you approach something in your life that's of great value, as you get closer to it, as you make progress toward it, what happens is you experience joy in life. And if that good thing is not defined, then you can't do it. So you have to have a law. You have to have a God. You have to have the greatest thing that exists defined for you. It's not enough to say, I'm a spiritual person. Have you had people say that to you? I'm not religious, I'm just a spiritual person. Well, that sounds great, but in the end it does nothing for you, because if it's not defined, then it does no good. You have a need for a standard, but the problem is, and this is the reason people go to this, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, is because once that standard is defined, well, then you can fail in relation to it. And when you fail in relation to the standard, well, then you have a problem. And the problem is that this is a bigger issue than all of us really realize. You know, this is the problem of sin. And if you go down to like Mill Avenue, you go down to some mall someplace, and you ask people, well, do you have sin in your life, and is it a big problem? They'll probably say, yeah, I have some sin in my life. Is it a big problem? No. You see, we just don't understand. Sin is actually a much bigger problem than we can possibly realize. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 48, it says, "You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." You must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now, that's a pretty big standard to live up to. You have to be perfect. How many of you were perfect this morning? Now, I know that this is Sunday morning. So Sunday morning is the morning when it's the official day of the family fight. Right? It's the official day of the family fight. I don't know what it is, but it seems to be that the Sunday morning just seems to be the day that we all just need to get it out of our system. You know, we just need to do it. But the thing is, so how many of you guys were perfect this morning? None. How many of you guys have been perfect since you've been sitting in this room? You see, the problem is that we are so imperfect. If we actually stop to think about it, our imperfections are so egregious. They're so pervasive that it's really amazing that any of us can live with ourselves. Now, I say that in the nicest way possible, but it's true. And it leaves us with basically three choices, and these choices are serious choices. Because the thing is that once you have a standard and you're not making progress toward it, you're not living up to it, then that standard becomes your judge, and it becomes weighty, and it becomes heavy. And that burden has to be dealt with in some way. Sin must be dealt with. It must be dealt with. And so how are you going to do that? Well, there's three choices, really. You can attack goodness. You can attack the standard. And people do this. And this is kind of the time in our culture that we live in, is that all standards are evil. Right? There's only one sin, and that's to say that anything is sin. As long as you don't, then everything's fine. So attack the standard. The standard is terrible. It's oppressive. Of course it's oppressive. That's what standards do. It excludes things. That's what standards do. It gives no joy. It gives no meaning. It's a terrible thing. Just get rid of the standard. Well, now we're back in the place that we started with, which is we can't experience joy. We can't get closer. We don't know where to point our lives. We don't know when we've done good or bad. We have no way of figuring out where we stand in the great scope and scheme of being. So that becomes a problem. But the second way that we can go is we can say, well, I'm not going to attack the standard. I'm just going to attack other people. I'll focus on their faults and flaws, because that's a great distraction. And it is. It's very enjoyable. I suggest, if you want to see how enjoyable this is, go to a mall, go to an airport, and just criticize people. You don't have to do it out loud, just in your mind. Just criticize people. It's incredibly enjoyable. We as human beings are made for this. What's even more fun is if you have someone who's close to you where you guys can share the criticizing enjoyment together. Because that's what they said when you got married, right? You're going to double the joys and half the sorrows. No, it's seriously that we as human beings, you guys know I'm telling the truth. We as human beings, we do this. We do this a lot. And we can even get to the point where if it's not distracting enough from our own sins, what we can do is we can just blame our sins on other people. Well, I wouldn't be this way except for this, except for my mom was this way. I wouldn't be this way except for my dad was this way. I wouldn't be this way except for my spouse is a certain way. I wouldn't be this way except for, right? Well, what does that do? That gives us isolation. Pretty soon we hate everyone. And we become isolated from everyone. And then so the third option is that we attack ourselves. And this gives some relief because, do you guys, anyone here watch The Office? Anyone watch The Office? You guys remember when they were doing safety training and it went horribly wrong and Stanley had a heart attack? And Michael gets called with Dwight to New York and they're getting yelled at. And remember what Michael does? Is he gets up and he walks around and he goes and sits down on the other side of the table from Dwight so that he's now pointing at Dwight. It's not him and Dwight getting in trouble. He's helping. Well, the reason that we attack ourselves is because we are Michael. I hate to break it to you. We're Michael Scott. And what we do is if we're accusing ourselves, then yes, we're receiving some of it, but there's a little bit of something that releases that because we're also the one pointing the finger. The problem is that there's a spiral downward that happens that's just, it's unendurable. So the problem is that the standard, if we apply it to ourselves, we need it, but we can't survive it. We can't live with it, and we can't live without it. But in this passage, what we see is that the standard is personal, and that personal standard is calling us to glory. There's an invitation to us that is out of love, that has to do with this idea that God has been the standard the whole time, and He's unapproachable. He's so far above us, we can never reach Him, and yet His desire is to share Himself with us. His desire is that we participate with Him. His desire is that we become glorified. His desire is that we not only be called beautiful, but we become beautiful. His desire is not just that we be called righteous, but that we become righteous. His desire is not that we just are seen as having wisdom, but we truly are wise. You see, that's what God desires for us. He desires to be married to us. He desires to be one with us. He desires to have His life imparted to us. And a standard that is not personal can never do that. It can only be your judge. And so Jesus says, and this is so great, He says, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." How can He say that? Because He knows Nathanael. Here is the standard that says, I know you. And I just don't know you. I can see you. I can see your whole life spread out in front of me. Why? Because it says, I saw you sitting under that fig tree. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the fig tree in Israel was that people would plant them outside their houses to provide shade while they studied the Word. The fig tree was a place that you studied the Word on. This Nathanael's been searching. He's been looking for Jesus, and Jesus says, I know your heart. I know you're looking for me. Here I am. I am the standard. I am the Alpha. I am the Omega. I am the beginning and the end. I am the greatest of all things, and I know you, and I love you, and I'm calling you into a relationship with me. There is no other religion that you will ever find that offers a picture of God that Christianity does. Well, finally, we need to, in the last few minutes we have, talk about integration in the temple. So one of the things that's interesting, as I pointed out earlier, is that He says, you believe because I saw you under the fig tree in verse 15. And in verse 51 He says, and He said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Now, one of the reasons that this is really interesting is it harkens back all the way to Genesis chapter 28 in verses 10 through 13. It says, Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he came to a certain place and he stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of that place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. Now, you know you're hard up when you're sleeping on the ground and a rock is your pillow. I mean, that's rough. It says, and he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached toward heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said to him, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give you and to your offspring. So what happened is that he sets up an altar there, and he calls it Bethel. And that means the house of God. Because the house of God is the place where heaven and earth meet. And that's what he saw. He saw this place where heaven and earth touched. Where God touched the earth. And that later becomes the idea behind building the temple, and before it the tabernacle. The tabernacle and the temple were the place where God's presence touched. And what Jesus is saying here, He says, look, you're believing me just because I said that I saw you under the fig tree? He's like, you're going to see something much greater than that. You're going to see something much, much greater than that. You're going to see the temple. And it's me. You're going to see Jacob's ladder, and it's me. This was the picture that Jacob had. This was what the temple and the tabernacle were referring to. It's me. And that is fantastic news. And the thing is, that's funny is, I think a lot of people would say, well, I don't really understand that, so I'd actually be more apt to believe Jesus if he just told me what I was doing yesterday. I saw you on the couch binging Netflix. I believe. Why? Because we don't really understand what this means. It means that Jesus is the mediator. Jesus himself, in Jesus is where heaven and earth meet. It's where everything spiritual and everything physical comes into one. And that means it integrates them. And this is the problem, you see. This is the problem with standards and sin and all of the stuff that we've been talking about. The problem is that we disintegrate ourselves and we end up in death. And what I mean by that is this, is that we have to find something that points everything in the same direction, that makes sense out of everything in our lives, that orders everything in our lives so that everything is right and good and healthy, because we tend not to do that. And let me say this is so important. You can say, well, I live for cars, I live for my job, I live for motorcycles, I live for my wife, I live for my kids. That is not enough to integrate everything in your life. And if you don't, then death awaits you. And you can't just choose not to have a standard either, because that leads to disintegration bigger than anything you can imagine. I mean, you say to yourself, well, if I just don't have a standard, the integration will be, I'll do whatever I feel like I want to do. How many of you ever tried that? Have you ever tried just living however you feel like living? Hey, I'll be integrated. The integration will be me. I'll be the standard. I'll be God in my life, and whatever I feel like doing is what I'll do, and everything will come together, and I'll be happy. How many of you guys have tried that? Anyone want to admit to that? I've tried it. It doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? That's the fastest way to disintegration you can possibly imagine. Imagine this. How many of us want to be fit and beautiful? Anyone want to raise their hand on that? Fit and beautiful. Okay? How many of us, when it's mealtime and we're at the Golden Corral, want to eat lots of food? Anyone? Okay? Maybe not Golden Corral. Insert your own thing there. But here's the thing. Have you noticed that if you follow yourself, it's the quickest way to disintegration? Because while you're eating the meal, you want to eat a lot. But then after the meal, you want to be fit. You see what I'm saying? Following your heart is the quickest way to hell. Because you cannot agree with yourself even for 5 minutes. You cannot get all of your actions pointed in the same direction. You cannot get everything moving towards something that will bring you joy and happiness. You cannot do it. And if you try to follow your heart, you will find yourself in hell faster than any other way. Because everything you do will make you mad 10 minutes later. You will constantly be like, why am I like this? Why is my life like this? Oh, I'll do this. I'll do that. Oh, why does it always turn out this way? It's the quickest way. What you need is you need to meet the one who brings everything in reality together. And you need to follow him.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to his church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.